Hello, the internet. Welcome to the second episode of Redbox Roleplaying. I am your host, YouTube's Professor Rocket. And over the last couple of months, in quarantine due to a certain public health crisis, I'm not going to mention by name for fear of being demonetized, I've had a chance to look through a lot of old books. And like a couple of, right before quarantine, I asked one of my coworkers if they'd be interested in playing in a new campaign, and they were like, sure. And then I said, it's going to be second edition, and they're like, oh no, sorry, rogues suck in second edition. And I thought about that for a while, and I decided, is that true? Did rogues suck in second edition? Maybe it's because I grew up with it. I never realized it. And I think for someone who's only played 4th or 5th edition, a second edition rogue would suck. Because back in the day, there was no real balance between the two classes. I mean, between the classes. The balance basically came from them balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Rogues had skills. Nobody else really had skills. I think first edition revised and second edition introduced proficiencies that kind of worked like skills, but it wasn't quite the same thing. If you had, it's not like today where anybody can attempt to pick a lock, or anybody could attempt to like tame an animal. If you didn't have that skill, and most of the time it had to be specific to your class to be able to do it, you just couldn't do it. You could roll like basically an ability check if it was something that was related to one of your main ability scores, and it's something you could reasonably do untrained. You could do an ability check. Otherwise, you just couldn't do it. And I thought about, also a lot of people just don't realize how different the editions are, but also how they're basically the same similar core. So today we are going to be talking about first edition. And another thing a lot of people don't realize is that for almost half its history, Dungeons and Dragons wasn't just one game, it was actually two. And when it was first created, it was actually basically an expansion of Gary Gygax's original chainmail system. It was not originally intended to be a fantasy role-playing game. It was really a war game. It was a miniatures war game. He was really fascinated with an old Avalon Hill board game called Gettysburg, and he wanted to do something like that, but with like medieval themes. And Dungeons and Dragons was actually like an add-on to that chainmail system that they came up with later. Now around 1978, they came out with Dungeons and Dragons Basic. Like prior to this, the whole game had just been called Dungeons and Dragons, and it was just a series of add-ons for chainmail, basically. So first edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then Basic Dungeons and Dragons. But this basically uses the same rules as these books. It's just tamped down to basically what you absolutely need to know to start the game. So this is basically the same system. It's just whittled down from 500 pages to about 50. So here we have the first edition, and I think we should start with PCs first, character creation, and the classes that are available and the ones that are not available. It can be kind of surprising what's not available. Now, in first edition we had as starting classes cleric, druid, fighter, paladin, ranger, illusionist, thief, assassin, and monk. Now you're probably right away wondering, where's bard? Well, you can be a bard in first edition, but you can't start as a bard. That's very interesting, and I will get into that later. I want to talk about bards on their very own. And let's see, the races you could be in first edition. Let's see where that was. Okay, of course, human, dwarf, elf, gnome, half-elf, halfling, and half-orc. Half-orc was actually... Half-orc and gnome actually were left out of the core second edition rulebooks when they came out, but they got added back into third edition, later editions. Now... there's also restrictions for gender. And this is something that would not fly today. In fact, wasn't carried over to any other edition. It was specific to first edition. And it's only strength. But basically, females top out at a maximum strength. Even when males of the same race don't, or if males top out at a higher strength. And let me see, there's actually two charts with that in here. One's easier to read than the other, but I can't find it. So let's see, maximum strength for a female halfling is 14. Maximum strength for a male halfling is 17, so 3 points lower. Maximum strength for a female gnome is 15, whereas the maximum strength for a male gnome is 18/01 through 50. Now, strength is really weird in first and second edition. It's not like from third edition on where you have where you can actually go over 19. You can't go over 19 in first edition. I think you can in second, but if you go over 18, you go into what is what's basically called giant strength, and it's like a percentage after the 18, like 18 slash. And then there's like crazy checks for when you're trying to do like incredible feats beyond normal human strength. Basically, but maximum human strength is 18/00, which is 18/100. For male humans, that is, the maximum strength for a female human is 18/01 to 50. But yeah, females of every race have got strength restrictions. Now, some people might argue that that's realistic, but if you're playing a fantasy game, why did you want, why do you want something that's kind of discriminatory in your fantasy game? You don't want to be held back. Now sometimes I actually argue in favor of realism in certain things, but this isn't something I would have house ruled this out when I was a kid. And in fact, I did have a house rule about female characters. You could willingly, it wasn't an imposed penalty, you could willingly reduce your strength to increase a different stat. So basically making strength a dump stat if you wanted to. But I never made that mandatory. Yeah, and that's not the only instance of blatant sexism we'll find in this book, so hang in there, folks. Speaking of things that would not fly with today's Dungeons and Dragons players, if you were playing any race but a human, you were restricted in what classes you could play and how far you could advance in level of the classes you could play. So, for example, humans could be any class and could advance to any level. Let's say, for example, elves. Elves could not be druids. Elves could not be paladins or rangers or illusionists or monks. They could be clerics or fighters. They could only advance to level 7 in either of those. They could be a magic user, but they could only advance to level 11. They could be an assassin, but they could only advance to level 10. No race except for human could be a paladin. No race but humans and half elves could be rangers. This was pretty much the first thing I house rolled out when I was a dungeon master. And it's something that they eliminated altogether in 3rd edition. As you could basically be any combination of race and class after that. Of course, excepting for paladins could only be lawful good. So you couldn't be a class that couldn't be. You couldn't be. Some races are only certain alignments. So let's see. Now, one thing I'm going to complain about is the arrangement of the rule books. And by the way, these are the reprints from 1983, when they wanted to have the more, I guess, parent-friendly covers. These were the more recognizable first printings, the Scary Demon covers from 1978 and 1979. For those of you who weren't around back then, there was this sort of what we call today the Satanic Panic toward the end of the 70s and early 80s, where Dungeons and Dragons and rock music and a lot of other things got wrongly associated with Satanism, and it was an ongoing thing. So around 1983, DSR started cleaning up their image with basically prettier covers, less demonic looking, although the content's still the same, which is funny. In the monster manual there's actually some nudity, so poorly drawn nudity, but it's there nonetheless. So here's my big problem. The character generation rules, for the most part, are in the Dungeon Master Guide. The player's handbook tells you that you need to generate 6 ability scores, 3 through 18, but it doesn't tell you exactly how to do that. This basic rule book says you just roll 3d6, presumably in order, and that's what a lot of people think the traditional character generation was, and I guess if you had that rule book, then it was. This doesn't specify, so maybe a lot of people assumed it was and went with it. But in the Dungeon Master Guide, it actually has 5 different methods for generating ability scores, and some of these are more more in line with what we would use today. And it says that while it is possible to generate some fairly playable characters by rolling 3d6, there is often an extended period of attempts at finding a suitable one due to quirks of the dice. Therefore, these rather marginal characters tend to have a short life expectancy, and which tends to discourage new players as having to make do with some character of a race and or class he or she didn't really want, can't or won't identify with. Character generation then is a serious matter, so it goes on to list 4 different methods. So, method 1. All scores are recorded and arranged in the order the player desires. 4d6 are rolled and the lowest die is discarded. Method 2. All scores are recorded and arranged as in method 1. 3d6 are rolled 12 times and the highest 6 are retained. Method 3. Scores are rolled according to each ability category in order: strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution, charisma. 3d6 are rolled 6 times for each ability. 6 times for each ability. And the highest score in each category is retained for that category. I think if I rolled 6 times for each one, I don't think I would have anything less than a 14. Maybe I just have good dice, but, you know. And method 4, 3d6 are rolled sufficient times to generate the 6 ability scores for 12 different characters. The player then selects the single set of scores which he or she finds most desirable, and these scores are noted in the character record sheet. So basically, roll up 12 different characters, keep the one you like best, and throw the other 11 away. It's a lot of work. You might as well just cheat and make up your own ability scores at that point. Yeah, but there's a lot of old time players that say that's what you did, is you rolled 3d6 in order, and that's what you were stuck with. And that's not true even back in 1979. So one of the things that is, grossly different, well, 2 of the things that are grossly different about first edition is armor class and THAC0. And this was something that changed starting with 3rd edition. In the first 2 editions, armor class started at 9 or 10 and was descending as it improved. So in the very original editions, the best armor class you would have is 0, and they realized that didn't leave a lot of range for more powerful monsters, so they actually increased the range to include negative armor classes. So the best possible armor class, I think, was supposedly negative 10, but I think I've seen monsters with negative 13. And so with 3rd edition on, you have a positive armor class. The attacker has an attack bonus. They roll a d20, add the attack bonus, and if that number is higher than your armor class, then they hit. In 1st and 2nd edition, there was an extra step. Because there was a negative armor class, there was an extra conversion. So they came up with a score called THAC0. THAC0 was an acronym for 2-hit armor class 0, and that was basically your base attack score. So if you had a THAC0 of 15 and you were attacking something with an armor class of 5, you would deduct the 5 from your THAC0, and so you needed to roll a 10 or better to hit that. So THAC0 is another thing, whereas a higher base attack bonus in 3rd edition on is better, a lower THAC0 is better in 1st and 2nd edition. So, and again, when you get to negative armor classes, you're subtracting the negative armor class, which means that the negatives cancel out, and you're adding the absolute value of the negative armor class to your THAC0. What? Okay, so THAC0 blew a lot of people's minds, and believe it or not, it's better than what they had before. THAC0 was a simplification of what I'm going to talk about next. So if your THAC0 was 15, your opponent's armor class was -5. The two minuses cancel out, and you're adding the 5 to your THAC0 instead, so you have to roll a 20 to hit them. Some people I played with for 5-10 years, and they never understood THAC0, and I basically had to explain it to them every time they rolled an attack roll. But it is better than the alternative, which is what they had before. And I'm thankful I wasn't playing when this was the standard, because I wouldn't have played long. There's basically these 4 charts where they have the classes grouped, and they list the defender's armor class, and then you have to look up your level and class to see what you would need to roll to hit them. And again, this is only in the Dungeon Master guide. It's not in the player's handbook. So the Dungeon Master is the one behind his screen looking to see if you hit or not. Later editions, I think, took a lot of the responsibility and a lot of the secretive, sneaky stuff that was going on in the background for the Dungeon Master only, and basically gave the players a lot more control over it. So let's see. An interesting thing that I found in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and well, okay, so before we pass up the topic of character creation, bards. Like I said, you can't start as a bard, but bards are included from the first edition. So how can you be a bard if you can't start as one? Well, here we go. First off, bards may not be allowed by your dungeon master, so they're basically an optional class. A bard must have scores of 15 or better in the following abilities: strength, wisdom, dexterity, and charisma, and must have at least 12 in intelligence and 10 in constitution. That's 5 scores of 10 or better, and 3 that are better than 15. So that's already a really steep requirement. A bard must be human or half-elf. Bards begin play as fighters and must remain exclusively fighters until they have achieved at least the 5th level of experience. Anytime thereafter and before attaining 8th level, they must change their class to thieves. Again, sometime between 5th and 9th level of ability, the thief must leave off thieving and begin clerical study as a druid. But this time they are actually bards and under druidical tutelage. And so you basically discard all the experience you had before, and you're just starting over with a brand new experience chart. It doesn't really... So, so you keep the number of hit dice you had from before, apparently. But they become D6s, so I guess you re-roll. Yeah, you re-roll. Well, no. I don't know. It's a mess. Yeah, basically they've got their own 2-page appendix here in the back that explains how to create and play a bard. I don't think I ever would with requirements like that, but especially since it's from 2nd edition on, they're starting glass. Yeah. So, also, for those of you who don't know, back in the day, there was no such thing as cantrips. If you were a level 1 magic user, you had 1 spell per day. 1 level 1 spell per day. So you better pick a good one, because once that's gone, you're done for. Yeah, basically you just had to hide in the back. Wait for a chance to cast your spell, and then you were done for that day. So 2 interesting and odd things I also found in the Dungeon Master's Guide is there's actually a section for handling troublesome players, which is pretty interesting. I've not seen any other edition actually have that in the rules, but some players will find more enjoyment in spoiling a game than in playing it, and this ruins the fun for the rest of the participants, so it must be prevented. Those who enjoy being loud and argumentative, those who pout or act in a childish manner when things go against them, those who use the books as a defense when you when you rule them out of line should not be excluded. Should be excluded from the campaign. Simply put, ask them to leave or do not invite them to participate again. Peer pressure is another means which can be used to control players who are not totally obnoxious and who you deem worthy saving. These types typically attempt to give orders and instructions even when their characters are not present. Tell other characters what to do even though the character role they have has nothing to do with that of the one being instructed. Oh, that's an interestingly constructed sentence. Or continually attempt actions or activities their characters would have no knowledge of. Strong steps short of expulsion can be an extra random monster die, obviously rolled. The attack of an ethereal mummy, points of damage from blue bolts from the heavens. See, I don't know about using in-game things to deal with problem players. I think if somebody's ruining the game for the other players, it's best to talk with them sort of off stage. And my first video was even a story about that. But yeah, you're not parenting them. You're either they want to play the game that you have, or they don't. But I just find it very interesting that the book would actually give pointers on this, which I would love a whole chapter of it. So I think, to me, I think it's best to just talk with the player off stage in a very diplomatic way. Because a lot of the times when they're playing the way they want, they don't realize that they're spoiling the game for everybody else. And I think once you make them realize that, if you make them feel kind of ashamed for ruining the game for everybody else, that, well, most of the time corrects their behavior. Unless they're somebody like Jerry and have no shame. So here was the thing that, well, one of the things that I was most surprised to see. This was quite a different game back in the day, flavor-wise. Hasbro owns it now, so of course it's pasteurized and homogenized pretty much beyond recognition compared to first edition. But there is the Random Harlot Table, in which you can randomly roll different types of horrors to encounter. So here we go. Harlot encounters can be with brazen strumpets or haughty courtesans, thus making it difficult for the party to distinguish each encounter for what it is. In fact, the encounter could be with a dancer only, prostituting herself as it pleases her, an elderly madam, or even a pimp. In addition to the offering of the usual fare, the harlot is 30% likely to know valuable information, 15% likely to make something up in order to gain a reward, and 20% likely to be or work with a thief. You may find it useful to use the subtitle below to see what sort of harlot encounter takes place. 1 through 10 is a slovenly troll. 11 through 25 is a brazen strumpet. 26 through 35 is a cheap trollop. 36 through 50 is a typical streetwalker. 51 through 65 is a saucy tart. 66 through 75 is a wanton wench. 76 through 85 is an expensive doxy. And let's see, 86 through 90, a haughty courtesan. 91 through 92 is an aged madam. 93 through 94 is a wealthy procuress. 95 through 98 is a sly pimp. And 99 through 100 is a rich banderer. So there you go. Why roll for random monsters when you can roll for random horrors? So yeah, so like I pointed out here, just looking at the spines and the thickness of the book, they've got, the Dungeon Master's Guide is almost twice as thick as the Player's Handbook. And I think they realized their error, because here's the second edition ones. They basically switched. The Player's Handbook is thicker than the Dungeon Master Guide, but not as significantly as this difference. Yeah, there's so another thing about first edition that's different about 5th edition. And I think I mentioned it before that not everybody had skills. Basically, rogues had all the skills, or well, thieves had all the skills, and rather than being rolled on a d20 and having a modifier, they had like a percentile score in a particular skill, and they would roll percentile dice, and if they rolled their skill level or lower, they succeeded. And that's something that was so sometimes low rolls were better in 1st and 2nd edition. When you were doing an ability check, you wanted to roll your ability score lower. When you were doing a saving throw, though, you wanted to roll over your saving roll score. So that's probably why Dungeons and Dragons has become a lot more mainstream from 3rd edition on, just because there was a lot more math to do in your head, and it wasn't consistent. Nowadays you use the d20 for just about everything but damage. You use it for 2 hit, you use it for skill rolls, you use it for saving throws. And saving throws are something that were a lot different too. Um, like when you hit 0 hit points, you were dead. Um, some people house ruled it so that at 0 points you were unconscious, and if you got to -10, you were dead. But when you were unconscious, you were still losing hit points unless somebody stabilized you. And in fact, I think in 2nd edition, that's even an optional rule. Normally in 2nd edition, when you hit 0 hit points, you're dead. But they added an optional rule in the Dungeon Master's Handbook to where -10 is dead and 0 is just unconscious. But not in these books. 0 hit points are dead. There's no specific saving throw. What there is, though, is determined by your Constitution score. There's a resurrection probability, which means in 1st and 2nd edition, resurrection wasn't automatic and it wasn't certain, even if somebody's casting a spell. So you had like a resurrection percentage, and if somebody tried to resurrect you, you would roll, and if you rolled lower than that percentage, you succeeded and were resurrected, and your Constitution permanently dropped by 1. So your Constitution score was the maximum number of times you would be resurrected. It also determined the probability of your resurrection. So each time it dropped, so each time you're resurrected, it drops. So it's less likely you can be resurrected again. I thought that was really interesting. Pretty much these days, all that Constitution is used for is for saving throws and determining if you get bonus hit points. But back then, it determined your system shock and the number of times you could be resurrected and the likelihood of resurrection. System shock is anytime you go through anything traumatic, like being polymorphed, you roll system shock. If you fail, you die. Yeah, and that's kind of one of those realism rules. Suddenly being changed in form would be traumatic, and it would be something that maybe you would die from shock from. Losing a limb is something you might have to roll system shock for. Yeah, a lot of rules in 1st and 2nd edition seem to be sort of for realism, like arguably gritty realism. Yeah, I really admire 5th edition and its simplicity, but it's also lost a lot. When I was playing 1st and 2nd edition, it felt a little more grounded, even though there were magical elements. As far as what people could do physically, it seemed more realistic. Now everybody's got a vague block of skills that they don't really change all that much. It seemed like there were just a lot more customization options in addition to the realism back in 1st and 2nd edition. 3rd edition to me had a lot of problems, but as far as being able to create unique characters, that was probably the high point, because you could take feats and proficiencies and skills that were outside your normal class, but they cost more. There were some that were specifically restricted only to certain classes, but for the most part, you can learn different skills. You'd make more well-rounded characters. Sure, there were certain skills you wanted to pick if you wanted to min-max, if you wanted to be the most efficient version of your class. But like I don't know, the most efficient characters aren't necessarily the most interesting. And that's what I think 5th edition misses is interesting characters. Now there's charts in here to roll for like random character histories, random family members for them. But in 5th edition, it's basically you pick a class. That class gets to pick from like 1 or 2 backgrounds, and they get to pick between this starting kit and this starting kit. So there's only like 4 different versions of a paladin you can play. So if you and I are playing a paladin in the same campaign, and we made the same choices as far as those 2 things go, then they're basically going to be identical. There were crazy amounts of customization options back in 1st and 2nd edition. One of those books up there has got cheese making proficiency, and it's in the book, so it's legal. So any character I make for 2nd edition can have cheese making. Is it ever going to come in handy? Probably not. Is it interesting? Yeah. I don't. Can any of you say you have a 5th edition character that's a cheesemaker? Nope. I got a complete ninja handbook up there. I don't think they've introduced ninjas in 5th edition yet. There's tons of races in 5th edition, and tons of classes. But with basically just like the 4 core classes in the old versions, and then like the more elite classes like Paladin, Ranger. It just seemed like you could have more versions of a wizard. Like in Wizards in 2nd edition, could specialize in a school. So like a wizard that specialized in like I don't know, like what were the schools? Let's see. Okay, so like illusion, enchanting, charm, necromancy, alteration. Yeah, so like a wizard that specialized in necromancy would be nothing like one that specialized in illusion. And one that specialized in alteration wouldn't be anything like one that was an enchant charmer specialist. Yeah, it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of difference between classes in the newer edition, and what difference they are is mostly like cosmetic. Like, I don't know. It seems like Dungeons and Dragons has lost a lot of the character ad back in the day. Maybe it's because they were only releasing like a few hardcover books a year, and letting players basically homebrew for the most part. There's not a huge glut of box sets like there was back in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. So that guy that said that Thieves really sucked in 2nd edition is maybe he was right, but I think everybody sucked in 2nd edition. I think everybody sucked in 1st edition. It was a widely held convention in 1st edition that you didn't name your character until level 2, because more than likely you were never going to get to level 2. Um, People would come to games with just stacks of blank character sheets, expecting to die. Um, that's that's the way Gary Gygax ran the game. That's kind of the way it was meant to be. Now, is that the funnest way to play? I don't think so. I had a character that I ran for 3 or 4 years. I wouldn't have wanted to run through one of his meat grinder of modules. Um, but I do miss the relative realism and the unbalanced nature of the old game. Um, to me, fifth edition characters can just have they have all the skills. Like you pick proficiencies to a point, um, but everybody's got basically the same skill set. Everybody can do everything. There's not characters are not as specialized as they used to be. They're more generalized. Like um, rogues can fight like a fighter. They're not as good at it, but they can do it. Um, yeah, just it seems like Dungeons and Dragons has lost a lot of its flavor in the interest of being more balanced, being more fair to everybody. Oh man, back in the old days, it was not fair, but hey, it was fun. So yeah, I guess I'm done with my old man grumping about these kids and their newfangled fifth edition for now. I think I'm gonna make this a series. Maybe go through every edition. Also, I might do one on revised first edition because they put out a bunch of new rule books around 1983 that were supplemental to the three core rule books that tweaked a lot of rules and actually added a seventh ability score. And that's not the only time that's happened. But before I get carried away, I think I'm going to call that a video on oh, and one last oddity that I'm going to mention in first edition was psionics. It was a mess. I might do a video on it at some point, but I don't know that I can do it better than Spoonie, so go look up his Counter Monkey episode on psionics. It'll pretty much explain what you need to know. Yeah, it was something, believe it or not, all the way back in first edition. Basically, you have psychic powers, and yeah, you might have some useless power like bending spoons, or you might be able to kill people with a thought at level 1. So it's not as fun as it sounds like. Alright, so that's my thoughts on first edition. Yeah. So, you 5th edition kids these days, you're spoiled. But hey, keep on gaming. Keep the game alive. Even if it's quite different from the way it was when I was a kid.